I thought it was very instructive of, the certainly of the image they tried to create, which is that, this is easy. We're just shooting, torpedoing merchantmen, and it's kind of seen it as almost as a sort of surgical war.
Hello. In October 1939, U-47, a German submarine, approached Scapa Flow in silence as its crew prepared to attack. Their targets were British warships at port in the deepwater natural harbour. The U-boat's tubes were filled with water and 3 torpedoes were fired, heading for HMS Royal Oak. This mission, so early in the war, was a huge success for the Kriegsmarine and was commented on by Winston Churchill in the House of Commons. So began the U-boat war that would strike fear into both Churchill and the Allied High Command. Joining today is Roger Moorhouse, great friend of the show and the author of Wolfpack, Hitler's U-boat war, as we discuss the death rate the submariners faced, the threats from above, and what life was like underwater. Coming up on the 1st of November, I'll be hosting a live recording at the Imperial War Museum's live podcast show. Links are in the show notes. Plenty more great history on the way, but in the meantime, it's me talking U-boats with Roger. Roger, I mean, I don't really need to welcome you. You are a regular on here with a
like a
regular
bad
feature.
smell, Ollie, like a
Yeah,
bad smell.
not at all. But it really does give me a great pleasure to have you on today because we're talking about your new book, which is right up my street. Absolutely, really enjoying this. This is Wolfpack inside Hitler's U-boat war. So regular listeners will be aware of this because we've talked about it on 2 episodes of our film club. But this really is the book that, I don't know, this is the definitive history of the U-boat war during World War II. Is it
Well,
not?
I think it's filling a gap. It's more trying to look at the U-boat war from the German perspective, which is I think there's a gap in the narrative at the moment, or has been. So there are quite a few books on the Battle of the Atlantic, to be fair, and the wider U-boat war, but this aspect that I concentrate on, of the German side of things, what the Germans thought they were doing, how they viewed things, what was it like to spend 2 months on a U-boat in mid-Atlantic. All of that stuff is kind of absent from the standard narrative, which is very resolutely kind of, Anglo-centric, we could say. So that's the gap that I wanted to fill, and I thought, I was ideally placed to do so.
Indeed, because I mean, I think not only had a family member who was part of the U-boat war, but your proficiency in German helps with the research as well.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I found out, once I'd already started the book, had a sort of Sunday lunch with my in-laws, and my mother-in-law, who is German, sort of slightly airily announced that, oh yes, well, she had an uncle who was in the U-boat arm, and I kind of, blurted and said, like, how did I not know this? Why have you
Is
never
this
told
in
me this?
German, the Sunday lunch, by the way?
No, no, it wasn't. It was all in English. They live here. Yeah. So I said, how did I not know this? And she said, yeah, well, she remembered this guy. He survived. He was one of the few that survived. One in 4 survived. And she said he used to come to the house in the middle of the night. And it transpired, all that she knew was that he was survived the U-boat war and had been so damaged by the experience that he spent the rest of his life in a string of psychiatric institutions, from which he used to occasionally escape. And then the only place he knew to go was his family home. So it's a tragic story. And they had the unhappy task of having to phone the police each time to take him back again. Which I thought it kind of backed up. I mean, I was already writing the book, so in a sense, I can't use that as an origin story. It'd be quite a nice one if I could, but it sort of backed up my intention that I'd already, at least half formed in my head of wanting to tell the story from the German perspective, because I thought that really kind of illustrated, if you like, a sort of I suppose, a deeper truth, that these men, even just the few that survived, were profoundly damaged by the experience. And that became something that I wanted to try and bring out in the book.
Yes, if one thinks of that statistically, as you say, 25%, only 25% survive the U-boat war. And of that 25%, there'd be a significant number psychologically harmed for life.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that sort of, yeah, I say, reinforced my intention of trying to tell the story in the way that I have.
Well, I wanted to sort of help not only myself but listeners to really understand the kind of basics of a German U-boat, and I'm conscious that there were many different types, but and many different theatres as well. It's so interesting reading, because we're not just talking the Atlantic at all, are we?
No, not at all.
The Arctic, the Med, the Caribbean, even.
Yeah, and the Indian Ocean.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah, and so
and the Black Sea, weirdly,
right,
which is a fascinating story in itself. But yeah, cover that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this really was okay. So this is a form of warfare, form of naval warfare that the Germans are, or certainly Donitz thinks is a kind of a game changer for the Second World War, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Now, whether that is or not, that's a sort of different matter. But I would just want to understand what was a German U-boat, the number of crew, because as listeners may already be aware, we've talked about Crimson Tide, and you've got these huge modern day aircraft carrier size submarines. The German U-boats were not anything like as large, were they?
No, not at all. So the standard German U-boat of World War II was called the Type 7. About 70% of the fleet and the U-boat fleet was, I mean, they produced more than 1,000 U-boats of various types. So the vast majority of them are these Type 7s, and the Type 7 itself was a sort of an updated version, essentially, of the U-boat that they had at the end of the First World War. So that kind of dates it. It's really a submersible rather than a submarine, in that it is designed to motor on the surface, to operate on the surface. It can dive to evade attack or to attack itself. But it spends, its default is to be on the surface. It's faster on the surface, as these two big diesel engines, and it, that's how it would evade any pursuit. Generally, would be on the surface because it's faster, and then it would dive, in extremis. It can stay submerged for, depending on the variant, say 24 hours at most, on its diesel engines, and then it starts running out of water on its electrical engines. And then it starts running out of air for the crew. So that's a sort of an outline of it. It, in terms of they're 67 meters long, a Type 7, which doesn't mean much to me. But I always describe it as being two underground carriages. If you kind of picture that in your head, that's about the habitable space of a Type 7. And bear in mind that within that you've got, these massive diesel engines, electrical engines, hand wheels, gauges everywhere, pipe work, torpedoes, no less. So there's only one place in all of the interior of a Type 7 where two men can basically pass each other without doing a sort of embarrassed shuffle. And the crew of a Type 7 was about 50. So there's one surviving Type 7, which is at a place called Labour, up on the German coast, on the Baltic coast of Germany, as a museum ship. And when you go through it and you come out the other end, it's very, very extremely cramped. And then there's an information board that tells you that this had a crew of 50. And your first reaction, mine certainly was where the hell did they all stand? Like literally, even if they were standing still, it's hard to believe that they all fit. Never mind sleeping, working, fighting, all of that. So it's quite astonishing. And as a consequence, the crews are literally living on top of each other. They're hot bunking all the time. So any sort of nice skin diseases or whatever that are going around will go around the whole crew. They literally live in each other's pockets all the time. So uh, living conditions in this thing are pretty hideous pretty quickly. So that's a sort of an outline of a Type 7. It will carry, anything between 12 and 16 torpedoes. The torpedoes themselves are 3 meters long, so they're huge things. And it was a very effective weapon. It was quite primitive, but nonetheless, it was pretty effective for World War II standards. Yeah, so that's the Type 7. That was the standard.
And what depth could they go down to before they were, I guess, crushed by the pressure of water?
Yeah, so crush depth did vary with the variants that they
Because
had.
presumably it's strengthened steel is what the
Oh
hull.
yeah, so sort of rolled strengthened steel, and then it will all, of course, be welded and so on. So they're pretty precisely made. They
And
had
it's a
a
single hull, isn't it? Sorry to
no, it's
interrupt you
double
there.
hull.
Oh, it
It's
is
double
double
hull.
hull, is it?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, it's double hulled. So yeah, it's very the production quality is pretty good. Later on, they suffer with later marks and later versions. So there's Type 21, for example, which they introduced close to the end of the war, suffers with really poor production values, mainly because it's produced in a modular fashion by concentration camp inmates right across Germany. So they weren't too fussed about the tolerances and the precise measurements when they're basically being starved to death. So understandably, so the Type 21s never see action because they're constantly firefighting with all these problems they had. But yeah, so Type 7s were actually pretty well built, and it was a perfectly serviceable vessel. It did a perfectly good job.
And this was really going to be the U-boat was going to be the, I guess, the sharp point of the spear in naval warfare for the Germans. Because I mean, Admiral Dönitz himself is a submariner, so
Yeah.
this is something that I suppose he's passionately interested in. But really, this is the kind of the best way that they can get to the Allies is via U-boats rather than more conventional battleships and cruisers.
Yes. Well, that's disputed. I mean, actually, I think you just mentioned you asked about crush depths and stuff. It's upwards of 200 meters with Type 7s. I forgot to mention that. It's upwards of 200 meters. So the early one's about 200 meters and then up to about 250, 260. Not huge, certainly not by modern standards, but that gave them a degree of leeway, particularly to escape. So in terms of the vision, the strategy that we're talking about, Dönitz had a pretty good vision himself of the potential of the U-boat, the strategic potential of the U-boat. And he, as you said, he'd served in the U-boat arm in the First World War. So, he saw himself, as he put it, as a submariner to his bones. And when Germany is permitted to build U-boats again after 1935, and it pretty rapidly does, he's put in charge of the operation. And he very quickly is requesting a much larger piece of the pie, as in of resources and of manpower and all the rest, than the higher ups are willing to give him. And it's because he sees, his ideal, what he wants is to have a 300 boat U-boat force, which doesn't mean 300 out in the Atlantic at one time. It means 100 in the field, 100 being refitted, and 100 sort of going between either way between port and the theatre. He can only maintain 100 vessels plus in theatre by having 300 total. That's his maths, which is kind of logical. To give you an idea of the extent to which his pleas for resources and manpower and all the rest of it pre-war had fallen on deaf ears, you need to know how many U-boats he went to war with in September 1939. It's 27. Right? 27 combat U-boats. So yes, he saw the potential, but almost nobody else did. And the intention here, just to clarify, I mean, I think it's something that maybe is a little bit misunderstood, but the U-boat arm in Dönitz's vision is intended to carry out a tonnage war, effectively, to sink as many Allied merchantmen as possible, to strangle Britain into submission. They know that Britain is, to a large extent dependent, especially in wartime, on supplies, on food, on military hardware that's coming across the Atlantic, mainly from the Americans, or from elsewhere across the empire. So in that sense, they sort of perceive that Britain is uniquely vulnerable to this sort of tonnage warfare. So they're not necessarily attacking Allied naval vessels, i.e. Royal Navy vessels. The primary purpose is to attack merchant vessels. If the Navy get in the way, or if the Navy, counterattack and need to be attacked, then they will be, and they will be sunk as a result. But that's not the primary intention. The primary intention is to hit trade routes. So Dönitz sees that with absolute clarity, but kind of nobody else does in the German High Command. Until really late 1941, Hitler has this grand sort of conversion to the theory, and says, "Oh yes, well we're going to devote our attention to U-boat building and so on." By which time it's already too late. So this is one of the arguments of the book, is that there is a window of opportunity when the Germans might possibly have achieved their intention of strangling Britain. But by the time they've got the numbers to make it happen, the opportunity has already been lost. And that's one of the sort of grand strategic flaws of the whole enterprise.
And is this yet another example of Hitler? I mean, I guess again, for some, there's still a perception that he had some kind of military understanding. But is this yet another example of his failure to appreciate a kind of strategic advantage that Germany could have had? Because and it's not as if he wasn't aware of the threat of a U-boat, because I think in literally the opening weeks of the war, there is a stunningly successful raid at Scapa Flow that Hitler himself is fascinated by and hugely excited by, isn't there?
Yeah. So just to look at the sort of grand strategic first, yes, I think absolutely Hitler doesn't see that potential. You sort of you're casting some aspersions on Hitler's sort of military abilities there, and you're kind of right to. I mean, Hitler had a sort of almost a stamp collector's interest in military matters. He was passionately interested in military things. He loved being around military people. He loved telling them what to do, for one thing. He saw himself as the greatest armchair general that's ever walked the earth. What he lacked, and he did have a good head for all the minutiae as well. So he knew about different models of tank and things like that. And very often you'd have these accounts of military men who would go to him in the hope of convincing him and telling him how it should be, and they come out hugely impressed by his minute knowledge of the whatever it is, the Panzer IV or whatever it is. So yeah, he did have some abilities, almost like a sort of an autistic child, I suppose. He did have this sort of minute grasp of things, but he almost entirely lacked the grand strategic vision beyond what Dönitz always describes as this sort of continental myopia. I think that was the phrase he used in his memoir, which kind of makes sense that Hitler and a lot of the high command were so obsessed with the Soviet Union, with Lebensraum, with the Eastern Front, with all of that stuff that we know about, what was supposed to be Germany's empire in Europe, in the East. They obsessed about that to the detriment of everything else. And I think certainly to the detriment of the naval war. So the only thing that Hitler was interested in, as far as the naval war was concerned, was the sort of grand capital ships, which were sort of baubles, which were the signifiers of German grandeur, like the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst and the rest of them. He loved those because he thought they were beautiful things. And, for a long time, if you see it from a German perspective, they'd probably been looking at the Royal Navy as very much the expression of British power and of the British Empire. So for them to build, the Bismarck and the rest of them was at the very least aping that power and that expression of power. So he was interested in that stuff, but until really, as I said, until it was too late, he didn't recognize the potential of the much more humble and much less, at first sight, much less impressive U-boat. The strategic potential of that was arguably much greater than the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst and the rest, the surface vessels. But he'd failed to see that until it was too late. And then to go to the question you made about you asked about Scapa Flow, so 14th of October 1939, U-47 under Gunther Prien is sent into Scapa Flow in Orkney, and sinks the Royal Oak, which was a Royal Navy capital ship. About 860 men are killed, which is a pretty astonishing figure. It is a remarkable feat of seamanship, as Churchill, as First Sea Lord, actually says in the House of Commons. He praises Prien for his remarkable piece of navigation and seamanship in actually getting in and getting out again. The tidal races at Scapa Flow are absolutely hideous, as I'm sure an experienced yachtsman like yourself, Ollie, would appreciate.
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely.
Know that part of the high seas very well.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. But joking apart, I'm not sure if we are joking now, but as it says, the tidal
probably
races.
Do a podcast on it.
Just on that subject alone. But yeah, the tidal races up at Scapa Flow are hideous. So it was a remarkable feat for him to get in and get out.
And it's a very deep port, isn't it? And a huge port as well, for those who aren't aware. Yeah,
it is huge. I was up there as part of my research. I went.
You went up?
Yeah, I went and had a swim in Scapa Flow and had a little boat tour. It is vast, like it's so big you kind of can't see the other side. It's absolutely huge. Yeah, and there's a sort of a solitary buoy where the Royal Oak, where the wreck of the Royal Oak is, because a lot of the dead supposedly are still there. It's a war grave. Anyway, so yeah, that it was a remarkable action, and it propelled both Prien and his crew to celebrity status in Germany. They were whisked off to see Hitler, and Prien was awarded the Knight's Cross and all the rest of it. An instant celebrity in Germany. But what we have to remember, I think, and just before I come to that point, so for Dönitz, this was proof of the utility of the U-boat, but kind of in a weird way, because like I said before, his target is not naval vessels; it's merchant marine, different, right? So in a sense, you can see like the sinking of the Royal Oak is almost like a commando operation in a weird way, and yet what you're doing is sort of normal, naval operations against merchant vessels. So that's the sort of the headline, but still, it's taken as proof of German power, of German prowess, the German naval prowess particularly, and it's taken as proof that the Royal Navy, which was until that point seen as all-conquering, was vulnerable and could be hit. So this was an absolute fillip for the Germans and was seen as a sort of crushing blow for the Royal Navy. But as I say, the weird thing is that it is anomalous. It's an outlier, because that's not what most of the Atlantic War was about. That's not what the naval war was about. It was about hitting merchant vessels.
Hello, Ollie here. I wanted to let you know an event happening in London on Saturday, the 1st of November at the Imperial War Museum, Lambeth. This podcast, and others, are getting together for a podcast live day. Great friends of the show, Tessa Dunlop and Ian McGregor, will be joining me as we discuss how we memorialise war and the bomb that ended World War II. Head to the Imperial War Museum website for tickets or click on the show notes, and I hope to see you there. So if we place ourselves, as you must, as a historian of this period, in sort of 1939, 1940, U-boats, I suppose, submarine warfare was not viewed as it is, I suspect, today, thanks to our, the kind of percolation of culture, from pop culture, from films and things like that, where submarine warfare was such a key part of the Cold War. We view submarines as these, pretty impressive pieces of kit that are vital to our kind of defense. And even today, Britain's nuclear threat is delivered through a submarine. Mm-hmm. But in 1939, 1940, obviously have not gone through any of that. Are they viewed as almost a sort of luxury? I mean, what is a U-boat? What's the sort of view of the piece of kit itself?
Um, it's a good question. For the Germans themselves, I think it's a continuation of what was done at the end of the First World War. So it's kind of very familiar. It doesn't have the novelty value that the Luftwaffe has, for example. And they are, of course, part of the senior service, as it were. The German Navy. Not that it necessarily was that in the German canon. So there's sort of old naval traditions there as well, which is that is a significant point when it comes later on to how these crews behave and how they view their task and so on, which is a significant point that I raise in the book. So it doesn't have that sort of novelty value, but it is in that opening phase, it is seen as impossibly glamorous. And that's partly due to the propaganda, which is something I go into in the book. Um, there were films made, there were sort of features in the illustrated news magazines. People like Prian were sent on lecture tours, and they were on the front pages of the newspapers, and all of that. It was impossibly glamorous, and it was raised to that level because obviously that was part of the regime, not only celebrating its own successes, which naturally they would do, but also with one eye on making sure that the next generation of recruits, are keen to join the U-boat arm. So there's a wonderful article that I quoted, was an article from the Völkischer Beobachter, which was the Nazi newspaper. And it's probably fictitious. It's probably pure propaganda. It might be just sort of, lightly embellished. We will never know the difference. But it sort of, this article followed 3 recruits through I interviewed them during their naval training, and they're all sort of enthusing about how wonderful it is and how great it is to be at sea, and how their fellows there's tremendous sense of camaraderie with their fellows and all that, how the training is so brilliant and their commanders are so perspicacious and all this sort of thing. And then and at the end, one of them says, we can't wait to get out into combat. After all, what could go wrong? And then there's me with reading this. I was reading it in the British Library in the newspaper room, and I remember just bursting out laughing, saying, "You have no idea, my boy, what's going to go wrong."
75% chance of death.
Exactly. Yeah, but it shows you, I suppose. I mean, like I said, it's propaganda, so we don't know if it could even be entirely invented. But I thought it was very instructive of the certainly of the image they tried to create, which is that this is easy. We're just shooting torpedoing merchantmen, and it's kind of seen as almost as a sort of surgical war.
Right, shooting fish in a barrel in a
Fish
way.
in a barrel, exactly.
But it's funny. Another funny element to it, which I guess we shouldn't talk about the humor for too much, because it is, as you say, so many die. But the training, for selection for the submariners, unless I got this wrong, was if you're 18 to 23 step forward, if you're below 5'8" step forward, and then it's congratulations, you've just volunteered.
Volunteered. Yeah, I mean that was one particular memoir account of the procedure. I don't imagine it necessarily would have been massively different elsewhere. But yeah, it was that. I mean, they did sometimes, or did particular, and I do say this in the book, that the selection procedure was they would take or want to, prefer to take recruits with skills, with bona fide skills, whether that be plumbers, electricians, mechanics, for example. Those with practical skills. So
Plumber come in handy, presumably.
well, exactly. I mean, good with a leak, right? But it's a sort of relatively easy thing. If you take a peasant boy from East Prussia and give him some basic training and a rifle, you can go in the infantry. You kind of can't really do that with a submarine, because it requires a bit more specialist technological ability, even for the lowliest of sailors. So they did tend to sort of prefer those with such skills, and also people like people that had a background playing team sport, because the whole question of working in a team, the intensity of that in a U-boat is much greater than it is almost in any other field of military action. So yeah, that was the description that came from one memoir that you just described. But I think also in addition to that, there was a more, if you like, sort of scientific and more sort of targeted selection procedure from the mass of the naval recruits each time they came around.
Well, I was really enjoying reading all the, I mean, the accounts that like we've talked about with the training, but
Mm.
presumably a lot of these records for the submarines that survive are ship's logs written by the captains.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I mean, this is just sort of fascinating to read as a historian, isn't it?
yeah. It's great. It was great, absolutely wonderful, and they're all, those that have survived. Bear in mind that every U-boat on every patrol had to keep a ship's log, had to keep they're called KTBs, Kriegstagebücher, war diaries. Um, and there would be entries every day. And at the end of your tour, at the end of your mission, that would be handed in and it would be filed somewhere. So for all those U-boats that went out and didn't come back, particularly at the end of the war, where you've got there's huge losses in the back half of the war. Obviously, that particular edition of the KTB is gone. It's at the bottom of the sea, but they've still got the Kriegstagebücher from earlier in the war. It's stored somewhere, ended up in the archive. So, in spite of the huge losses, there's still a huge collection of material there. And a lot of that is digitized. A lot of it's even translated already. So at least it's translated or it's transliterated from German, but away out of handwriting and into type. A lot of it's available online, and then once you start trawling through them, it's fascinating stuff because some of them are less so, because some of them are quite sort of depends on the commander. So some of them are slightly lapidary, so they're a bit brief, and they will say sea state 3, wind whatever, so how many knots, um, uh, weather such and such, sighted convoy at grid reference X, and it's very kind of perfunctory. This is what they do, right? And then some of the commanders they obviously have literary pretensions or something, but they tend to write a bit more. So they'll write about the crew, or they say, oh, so and so was injured, or this person was sick, or they just give you a bit more to sort of work with. So as I was trawling through all of these, you couldn't really tell when it was going to be a commander that was much sort of more loquacious in his record keeping. But when you found one of those, they were brilliant, because it is literally written on the day. This is a summary of the day. This is what happened. And some of them are absolutely brilliant. So that's a lot of the material that I tried to sort of base what I did on.
Well, I was interested in reading some of the actions. I mean, the I guess the impression I had for a lot of U-boats, certainly in the Atlantic, is it's sort of torpedoing merchantmen,
Hmm.
and these are all one can't help but admire these sailors on the merchant ships,
Hmm.
sending supplies to Britain, and there are rules, though, that many of the U-boat commanders do adhere to, or the majority. I got the
Well,
impression.
they try to at least
Yeah,
adhere to
yeah.
those rules. Yeah, there's the so-called prize rules, which were codified in the interwar period. So it drew on an older tradition that goes back into the 19th century and probably beyond. But these were codified in the 19th century, in the interwar period, and written into international law. And it was basically a way by the international community to kind of make submarine warfare in the form that it had taken in the First World War, unrestricted submarine warfare, that famous phrase,
So the
to make
Lusitania is
the
what they're
Lusitania,
trying
for
to stop that.
example. Yeah. So it's an effort to make submarine warfare in that style so legally unviable, practically unviable, so that you just couldn't do it, because it stipulated that you had to stop the vessel in mid ocean. You had to board it. You had to then make inquiries as to what the vessel was, what it's carrying, where it's headed, etc., etc., to ascertain whether it's a viable target or not. If you decide it is a viable target, you have to then give the crew warning to get off the vessel. Once they're all off and in safety, you can then torpedo the vessel and sink it. But you are then, as the commander of the U-boat that has sunk the vessel, you are essentially responsible for that crew, right? Which it's not rocket science to explain that makes U-boat warfare utterly impossible to do. And that was the intention, really. So the Germans kind of start the war essentially trying, with numerous exceptions, but a lot of them trying to follow these prize rules as far as they could, and a lot of them hugely frustrated by it, because they knew that it's been designed to sort of make what they're doing impossible. And there are some ridiculous examples of them. There was a merchantman that was stopped in the western approaches. I think it was 1940. And it went through the right procedure. It was a merchantman on its own. It wasn't in a convoy, so they could do this. Got the crew off. It was a heavy sea. And the commander of the U-boat, because of the heavy sea, after he'd sunk the vessel, he said, okay, well, because it's quite rough, so I'm going to tow you to the Irish coast. He then spends 24 hours towing the crew of this vessel that he's just sunk to the Irish coast at Ventry, where they're ferried ashore in dinghies. This is insane. Like that's from anyone's perspective, this is no way to run a war. And there are many more examples. I mean, less spectacular than that one, less ridiculous than that one, but there are many more examples of U-boats sort of surfacing after an attack, at the very least, kind of asking the crew not only who they are, and what later on, they don't do the sort of stopping and searching thing, but they will interrogate the crew afterwards. What was the vessel? What was it carrying? Where was it headed? For example, just for their record, and then saying, do you need medical assistance? Do you need blankets? Do you want water? And at the very least, land is that way. So that is really genuinely not uncommon, which sounds surprising, I think, to our ears. But I think it fits in with what I was saying earlier on about those sort of older naval traditions. There's a degree of chivalry. I don't think chivalry is too big a word. I use the phrase in the book, the solidarity of the sea, where once the job is done and the vessel has been sunk, we're all sailors together. And there are so many examples of this that I think it's genuinely hard to ignore.
Yeah, I was really enjoying reading them. It was an element that I hadn't appreciated, I suppose.
Yeah.
You're so used to the German method of warfare on the Eastern Front and and across the West as well, that
Yeah, but again, one of no quarter, absolutely right, and wanton brutality. And as you well know, Ollie, I've spent the last sort of 2, 3 books of mine essentially in that place and writing about that stuff. So for me, this was a huge surprise, really. There's only one documented war crime carried out by U-boat crews, which was the sinking of the Peleus in 1944, which is where they actually machine gunned the survivors and the wreckage. And I talk about that, and I try and get to the bottom of what was going through their minds at that point, why they're doing it. But that in itself is remarkable. Of the thousands of vessels that they sank, there's one example where they carry out a war crime in the aftermath. Now, there could be others. There could be an example where they stop something mid-ocean, sink it, machine gun the survivors, and then they themselves are sunk, later in their patrol. So there's no survivors, no one to tell the tale. It's possible. But the point is, we've had 80 years of research and work on this, and nobody's come up with anything except the Peleus. So, that I found genuinely surprising, and I think it's one of the sort of standout points of the book, really.
Well, another area of warfare that I guess leads on to the psychological effects that I suppose your relative experienced, which is, I mean, the experience of depth charging, which I guess, rather than torpedo, is your main threat in a submarine.
Yeah, well, Yes and no. The main threat as it develops, as Allied countermeasures develop, is from aerial attack. That statistically is the most effective form of attack, because radar-equipped aircraft can, spot a U-boat from something like 5, 6, 10 miles. They can home in on it. And by the time the U-boat crew see the approaching aircraft, they probably have about 30 seconds to dive. So there's a couple of accounts that I use in the book of, U-boats being sunk, um, and literally having, a matter of seconds between seeing their aircraft, bearing down on them, and then trying to dive and not being able to, and then being sunk, with maybe one or two survivors. So it's the the speed with which that attack comes and the effectiveness of it is astonishing, compared to what was actually a rather cumbersome form of attack, which was, being tracked by a surface vessel, being forced to dive, then being depth charged, often for hours on end. I mean, it's psychologically very stressful, of course, but it's a fairly blunt weapon, certainly compared to aerial attack that I just described. So, there are
And it has
various
to be quite
methods.
sorry to interrupt again, but the depth
Well,
charge has to be quite close to the vessel
yeah,
to.
reasonable. Well, certainly to have, the way, interesting, you see that the profile of sinkings of U-boats kind of changes as the war goes on. So in the second half of the war, it is predominantly what I just described as aerial attack because it's the most effective one. Earlier in the war, it tends to be by depth charging. And what they tended to do, a depth charge could go off, it had a fuse that would, go off at a certain depth. So it'd be set to a depth, right? And if it went off within about sort of 20 to 30 meters of a U-boat, which is a good distance, really, that would be enough to cause damage. Any closer than that, and you're looking at sort of catastrophic loss, but that would be enough to cause damage. So it could, cause the U-boat to spring a leak because it would be at depth. It might be 100 meters. That's a huge amount of pressure that the U-boat is at. Would spring a leak, the gauges would burst, and maybe the lights would go out. You'd get ingress of water, um, probably a degree of panic in the vessel as well. And then it's up to the commander whether he thinks he can stay submerged and deal with those resultant problems and deal with the damage, or if he feels that he has to surface. And then the question is, can he actually surface, right? So the normal pattern in the early phase of the war is that you get U-boats damaged by depth charging that would then surface, essentially wave a white flag, get the crew out as best they could, and then scuttle the vessel. The vessel would be allowed to sink. So that's the sort of standard pattern of the early phase. And then you get to, later on, it becomes much more immediately deadly, in that you either have aerial attack, which I just described, which tends to be pretty fatal to the crew, because you're dropping bombs from the aircraft directly onto the target, pretty much, because they haven't had time to dive. So directly onto the target. So the impacts or the explosions are very close to the hull. So very often you get, catastrophic loss at that point. And then the other one is the advent of Hedgehog, which was this forward-firing spigot mortar that they had. They would potentially fire 48 of these mortars at any one time. It would go as an array like that into the water. And as a spigot mortar, it would actually detonate direct on impact. So if it didn't touch anything, it wouldn't detonate. But if that hit the hull of the U-boat that was there, and there's 48 of these going into the sea, if it hits the hull, it will explode on contact, and as you can imagine, that would be catastrophic as well. So the sort of profile of how these sinkings go changes as the war develops, as countermeasures and then countermeasures develop. So initially it is that, be forced to the surface and then would subsequently be scuttled. So you do get survivors and people taken prisoner. And then later on that tails off, because those two measures that predominate from the middle of the war onwards, Hedgehog and aerial attack, generally don't produce survivors. They produce, vessels that go straight down because they're catastrophically affected.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, really. I mean, and therefore you can see how you get to a 75% definitely.
Yes, indeed.
It's horrific. Well, I mean, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface, and I could talk for another 40 minutes with you, Roger. This has been absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much. And so, of course, listeners, links are where they always are, which is in the show notes. Roger, books just, I think, when we're speaking before publication, but it's just out. But thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
I've just realised we would have actually done our talk by the time this goes out, so I can't advertise it.
No.
But I can advertise it on our film club that's going out tomorrow morning, which have
Yes.
already been out for those
Yes.
listeners who are now probably completely confused as.
You just tied yourself in a knot there.
Yeah,
Ollie.
I have. I'm now not sure what day it is.
I don't know what day it is.
This is so Wolfpack, and I mean, this is just great stuff. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you. You're very kind. No, it was a great pleasure to write. So I hope it goes well.
Yeah, I think I can tell actually. It's and it rattles on. It
Rattles
allows
on.
the reader to rattle on.
Yeah.
It's
yeah. No, I think
cracking read.
it's very readable. It's got really good material. So I hope it'll be of interest to people.
Well, best of luck with it, Roger.
Thank you, Ollie. All the best.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes, including for those live events. Please share with friends and family, and if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.